Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to YCharts DataTables training webinar. I'm Caleb Eplett, an account manager here at YCharts, and I'll be hosting today's webinar. Here's a brief agenda of what we'll be going over today. First of all, obviously, how to access and navigate YCharts data tables. We'll also explore each type of table. We'll go over some common use cases. We will go over how to add companies and metrics to the tables, and then some of the advanced formatting options that you have capabilities of doing within the tables. And at the end, we'll save some time for some questions and answers. But please, as we go through the call, if you do have questions, please feel free to ask those as we go, and if time permits, I'll address those as they come in. Now, in order to display the data tables and go through the tool, rather than putting several slides together and doing it that way with images, I thought it would be better if we just go live onto the website. So just go live onto YCharts. And here you can see I am logged into my Pro Platinum account here on the home page at YCharts. So getting to the data tables is very easy. I'm just going to go to the top navigation bar here, right to the right of Screener. I'm going to click on the Data Tables tab. Now you can see within the data tables there are 4 sub-tabs, and these are the different formats of data tables that we have. The first is the multi-company comparison. Second is a multi-company time series, a single company time series, and then lastly a multi-indicator time series. We'll start with the multi-company comparison tab, the first one here, and explore this tab. So, as you can see by the example image here, the multi-company comparison gives you the ability to line up several companies and also several financial metrics and compare those metrics for each of the companies in your list. Some common use cases for the multi-company comparison are a comparable analysis, basically looking at a list of companies and comparing how those companies stack up against one another based on metrics that you might use to either value the company or assess that company's management performance or something of that nature. Another common use case for the multi-company comparison is a portfolio snapshot. So if you have several watch lists set up, or if you have a portfolio of holdings and you have maybe 15 or 20 metrics that you like to look at for all of the companies in your portfolios, and you like to do that on one chart, or rather one table, instead of looking at a chart, you'd like to see the numbers in a table, you can make those settings within the data tables here and quickly access all of those metrics for all of the companies in your portfolio and see what's been happening recently. Final common use case here on the multi-company comparisons tab is an industry analysis. So very similar to a comparable analysis, but rather than comparing one company to a list of their peers, an industry analysis will look at all of the companies within a particular industry, aggregate several metrics for those companies, and then compile averages and create benchmarks per se to stack companies within that industry up against. So now let's move on to the functionality here of the multi-company comparisons tab. Obviously the first thing that you need to do is you need to add stocks or add companies to your multi-company comparison. In order to do that, there's a couple of options. You can do this one company at a time in the left corner here where it says stocks or ETFs. You can just type in a ticker and hit enter, or click on the name that comes up in the drop down there and add a company one at a time. Now you can just continue to repeat this process and add companies down the list, or if you want to add companies more than one at a time, you can use the stock list button just to the right of that little add box. So if I click on the stock list button, what you see here is a familiar pop-up, something that we use throughout other tools in YCharts, including the screener. This is where you can use an add, exclude, or intersect logic to actually build a list of companies or stocks based on certain qualitative criteria. So the first thing we want to do is we want to add, and for example purposes, we'll start with the S&P 500. So I'm just going to click on Indexes, S&P 500. Now you might notice when you're working with the data tables, some data takes a few seconds to load. The data tables, unlike a lot of other areas of our site, it's actually scanning our database and customizing the way that data is returned based on your settings. So it does take a moment longer than some other tools, but hopefully shouldn't take too long. So now we have the S&P 500 loaded in here. I'm going to go ahead and click on the stocks list button again. And this time you see we have some intersect, exclude, and add logic options that we can choose from. The first time we didn't see these options because we had to start with a stock list and then use that stock list as a starting point to build this logic on top of. But now I can use this intersect button. I can keep that checked, go down to the sectors area and click on industrials and then view all. So now I'm only looking at industrial companies within the S&P 500. Now I can take this a step further, and instead of intersect, I can use exclude logic this time. Go back to that sectors tab, go within the sector that we have, industrials, and I can scroll down and I can exclude railroad companies. So now we've built a list here of companies. These are industrial companies within the S&P 500, and of course we've excluded railroads. Now if you were using the multi-company comparison as a way to do a portfolio snapshot or look at a list of holdings that you might have, instead of using the add, exclude, intersect logic with indices and sectors, you'd probably want to use the watch list option and pull in a watch list you've created of your holdings. But once you have all the companies added to your table, the next thing you want to do is you want to add the financial metrics that you want to look at. So you can do this, again, you can do this one at a time. From the financial metrics area here, I can search in the search box. So I can just type PE, and I can go down here and I can select and I can add a PE ratio. If you'd like to add financial metrics but don't know what you want to add right away, instead of using the search bar, you can use the browse menu. So if I click on browse here, it will bring up a table of all of the different metrics that you can add here in the data tables. There's about 4,500 different financial metrics that you can access within YCharts. So this is one easy way to find the metrics. They're categorized pretty well here. But again, our search bar, which represents it shows up here again, is a great place to get to all of those different metrics. Now, aside from adding the financial metrics one at a time, you can also add a metric set. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to remove the PE ratio here. And instead of using the typing box here or the browse button, I'm going to click on metric set and click on open. I'm going to scroll down here and I'm going to click on valuation multipliers. Now this is a set of metrics that I saved at one point, and now I can access this metric set every time I come back to the data tables. But you can see here I've got my list of companies, and now I have several EV to EBITDA, EV to revenues, EV to assets, several different valuation multipliers here that I can use to see what kind of multiples these companies are trading at. Now if you wanted to use this, you wanted to add a PE ratio as well, I can still just add a PE ratio just like we did before, and it will add it in addition to that metric set. Now you'll see up here by the name of my metric set it says unsaved. So if you wanted to save this with the PE ratio there, so that next time you come back there's a PE ratio included in your metric set of valuation multipliers, you just click on this drop down and click save, or you could click save as if you wanted to resave this with a new name. Now aside from adding metrics and adding companies here, there are several options that you have in terms of display options and summary statistics down here in the data summary. The first is the display options drop down. By clicking this menu, I can choose from several different components that I can check or uncheck to give me more information about the companies that are in my table. So all of the companies that we're looking at right now, they're all in the same sector, but it might be valuable to know what industry these companies are located in. So if I click on the industry checkbox, now I can see a column here with which industry each of these companies operates in. You can also click on this industry column to sort these companies by industry. You can also click on any of the valuation columns here if I wanted to sort that from in an ascending or descending order. Now just to the right of the display options here, you have some summary stats options. If I open up this menu, you'll see I can add a maximum, an average, a median, or a minimum to my table as well. If I click on the average button, I can now look at the average of each of these valuation multipliers that I have for all of these companies in the industrial sector in the S&P 500. So So this is a pretty quick way to get an average valuation multiple for an industry or a sector. You can just load the sector and industry into the tables, pull up your valuation multipliers, and then add the average line at the top. I can also go ahead and continue to sort these. The average won't sort in the middle, it'll stay at the top, so I can then compare it to some of the different companies here. So you can see our average EV to revenue multiple for the sector here is about 2.27, whereas for paychecks it's all the way up at 6.141. So now you have a pretty good benchmark to compare that to. Now the final option down here in the data summary, to the right of summary stats, is to export this data. So now that this is all organized in a nice table, we've included the average. If I click on the Pro Export Data button, it's going to download a CSV file that I can open up right into Excel or whatever program you might use, Numbers, and quickly get a view of this table nicely aligned and set up the way that I created it within YCharts. So that's a pretty good overview of the multi-company comparison. Next tab to the right is going to be the multi-company time series. Now you can see from the example image, it's a little bit different here. So whereas in the multi-company comparison we were working with several companies and several financial metrics, the multi-company time series gives us the ability to look at several companies once again, but we can choose one financial metric, but we can look at that value historically. Some popular use cases for the multi-company time series include trend analysis, so looking at a list of companies and seeing how their metrics have changed over time, maybe how they're being affected by some macro in macroeconomic environments. Another popular use case would be data compilation. So if you're just maybe you have a use case where you're working on a project and you need you have a whole list of companies and you need historical data for those companies, but you only need it for a handful of metrics. This is a quick way that you can access that data one metric at a time, export it to Excel. Then you can just put those spreadsheets together and create that database that you need for whatever type of project or analysis you're running. Looking at long-term averages over custom time periods is another good use for the multi-company time series, as well as just aligning fiscal calendars. So when you're dealing with a time series study and you're working with quarterly revenues, and some of the companies you're working with have quarters or fiscal years that end in December, some end in November, some October. It can be pretty messy when you're exporting that data to Excel. So what the DataTables tool does is it gives you the opportunity to align those quarters all in the same periodicity so you can export that to Excel without any blank cells or misaligned data. So now getting into the functionality of the multi-company time series here. Once again, the first step is to add companies. Now you can do this just like on the multi-company comparison. You can add companies one at a time, or you can use a stock list or that add exclude intersect logic, the same as we did before. For the example purposes here, I'm actually going to load a watch list this time, and I'm going to click on the watch list right here. I've got called S&P 500 yield greater than 3%, PE ratio less than 20. This is a list of stocks that I created in our screener. I just opened up the screener, pulled up the S&P 500, looked for companies with a dividend yield of higher than 3%, a PE ratio less than 20, and then saved it as a watch list so that I could access it here in the data tables. So now I can begin to add metrics. Again, since we're limited to two axes here, and our top axis is going to be time, because we're looking at historical data, I can only choose one metric. But here I'm going to add revenue growth. So since I pulled these companies up in the screener, I know they all have a pretty attractive PE ratio, pretty attractive dividend yield, but I might want to see if their revenues have been growing, if the companies are performing better this quarter this year than they did this quarter last year. So I added quarterly year-over-year revenue growth. First thing you'll notice though is we have several columns that look to be blank. Most of the data here is in the December 31st column. Got a data point here for Staples in January 31st. So my first step is going to be to align this data. I'm going to use the data options table here to do that. So if I click on the data options menu, you see several choices here, the first of which is the frequency of the data. So I'm going to choose my frequency. You'll see several frequencies you have to choose from: daily, weekly, bi-weekly, monthly, quarterly. This is where I'm going to focus since we are looking at quarterly data. I'm going to choose to align my data on a quarterly ending in October frequency. The reason I'm choosing October is because, as you can see, the quarter all the way to the left in our table is January 31st, which is the same as a quarter end in October. And I'd like to align all of my data as the most recent quarter being the January 31st quarter. So if I click on that option, oh no, everything disappeared. Well, that's okay. Now we need to choose our fill method so that we can fill that data from December up to January. So if I go up to the data options menu once again, I'm going to skip over the aggregation method and go down to the fill method option here. And I have three different options. I can fill forward, I can fill backward, or I can do no fill. So the view we're looking at right now is no fill. All of the data stayed in the columns it was supposed to be at. We hid those columns, we can no longer see them. I could fill backwards, which would take all of that data that we saw in December 31st, 2013, and it would move that data backward to October 31st, 2013. Or I can fill forward, and I can move all those December quarter end numbers forward to the January 31st, 2014 column. That's what I'm going to use. And now you can see we have all of our data aligned nice in a table, and I can quickly look at these companies, see what their revenues have been doing on a growth basis each quarter recently compared to that quarter last year. So here we're looking at revenue growth. I could also quickly change this to look at some dividend metrics. So maybe I want to look at dividends paid over the last trailing 12 months. I included dividend yield in my screen. So a lot of times when you're screening for companies that pay a dividend, it's important to look back and make sure that that dividend's been consistent over the last few years. So you can scroll down, you can see that. You see Kraft Foods here, they've only got one dividend listed. That's a pretty newly listed ticker ever since they spun off with Mondelez. But as we get down here to GameStop, we see some inconsistent dividend payment history. That might be something worth looking into. Another thing that I mentioned you could do with the multi-company time series, and a use case that we've seen pretty frequently, is looking at long-term averages. So right now I'm going to change the metric here from dividends. I'm going to change this to a PE ratio. So I have a trailing 12-month PE ratio. Now I'm going to go up here and I'm going to reset my data options because I don't want to look at my PE ratio on a quarterly frequency. So just by clicking reset all there in the data options, I went back to the default settings for the metric and companies that I have in my list here. So now I've got daily PE ratio history for all of these companies. So I can begin to look at averages historically and see what the PE ratio for these companies has been. For my analysis, though, I think daily PE history might be a little bit of overkill. So I'm going to change the frequency here. I'm going to make this monthly. So now I've got a nice list of each of these companies and what their PE ratio was at the end of each month. Now, one option that we skipped over in the data options menu here was the aggregation method. What the aggregation method allows me to do is, since we're looking at a periodicity here that is less frequent than our original frequency was for the PE ratio, I can choose how these numbers are aggregated to appear at the end of the month. You can see the end of period right here is the default, and that's what we're looking at. But instead of looking at the PE ratio from the end of the month, I might want to look at the average or the mean PE ratio throughout that month. So if I click on mean, it's going to run those calculations, and now I can see a table with each of these companies and what their average PE ratio was for each month listed as the last day of the month. I can now use the same display options and summary statistics buttons down here in the data summary section over to the upper right. So I could add display options. I could add a sector or industry. Since we're dealing with more of a portfolio here, adding sectors might be helpful. And I can also add summary statistics. So I can add an average again, and now I can look back every month and see what the average PE ratio was for my entire list of companies based on their average PE ratios from that month. I can also take this a step further. I can export this right into Excel, just like we did at the MultiCompany Comparison, just by clicking on the Pro Export Data button. I'm just going to open this file up. And I'm going to insert a column here in between D and E. And now I can use this column and I can actually calculate an average of the PE ratio each month of all of these companies, and then I can sort this based on the average PE ratio. So let's just go into the first column here, equals all right, so in the first line here, I've got the average of the last 5 years of the average PE ratios for this whole list of companies. So I can see that's right around 16. I'm going to go ahead and drag this formula down throughout the list of companies though. And now I can look at each company and see what their average PE ratio was over the last 5 years based on monthly averages. So I could then sort this from high to low, see which company's current PE ratio is cheapest compared to their 5-year average. Could see who's trading at a higher PE ratio. Maybe try to find out why the market's valuing them a little bit higher than they did in the past 5 years, and so on. That's a pretty good summary of the multi-company time series. I'm going to go ahead and move on now to the single company time series tab, the next one over to the right. So the single company time series, and you're probably catching on to the trend by now, we're changing our axes again. So we're dealing with only one company here, but we're looking at multiple metrics for that company, and we're looking at historical data once again. So some common use cases for the single company time series are company profiles. So if you like to look at a company in a very systematic way, you like to look at several metrics for that company, quarterly or annual, and see what's been trending, very similar to the way you might look at that in a value line book. You could set that table up here on the single company time series tab and access that quickly for whichever company you choose. This is also a good way to assemble data if you like to calculate your own custom ratios within Excel. So if you like to look at a multiplier based on the company's price and how much they spend on research and development, you could add those two metrics, export this to Excel, and quickly run a calculation to see what historical data has been for the company you're looking at for that custom ratio. Or again, you can use this as a data compilation tool. So if you need 10, 20, 30 metrics for every company that you're studying, and you're studying 5, 10, 15 companies, you could do this pretty quick here. Just set up your data table with the metrics that you need and the periodicity, and just hit one company at a time and export that into Excel. But now to get into the functionality here, as we're only working with one company here, the first thing to do is add the company that you want to work with. So just type the ticker into the box up here, hit enter, click add, or just click on the name of the company right there. And then we want to add metrics. Now just like on the multi-company comparison, we could add these metrics one at a time. So I could add revenue, could TTM revenues for Intel here. And let's also look at a PE ratio. So once again, our PE ratio is going to have daily history, whereas our revenue was a quarterly figure. So our data is not aligned very nicely in this table. So I'm going to use the data options menu up here to align this a little bit nicer. So I'm going to choose a frequency of quarterly ending December. I know that Intel has a December fiscal year end, so I'm going to use that quarter calendar. And now once again, instead of looking at the PE ratio for the last day of the quarter, which could be an anomaly, it could be a fair representation, but we're not sure, I'm going to change my aggregation method here to mean. So now I'm looking at Intel's TTM revenues from each quarter end, and also their average PE ratio from each quarter end. Now, aside from adding metrics one at a time and comparing those and aligning that data on a quarterly or custom time period basis, You can also use this to look at a company profile by adding a metric set or several metrics at once. So one metric set that I have saved here, if I click on Open, is the financial statement summary down here. So here I've got most of the major line items from income statement, balance sheet, cash flow statement. So I can look at this and see, every quarter what Intel's kind of top and bottom line numbers have been, and see how that's been trending over the past several quarters. I can also use my data options here and change this to an annual table. And right now these are just the quarterly numbers for the end of December, but if I change my aggregation method here to sum, I can now look at my same exact view, this company profile view, but now I'm looking at annual data, which is the sum of the 4 quarters in each situation. I didn't have to rebuild that whole table using annual figures instead of quarterly figures. Obviously, again, you could export this data from the single company time series if you want to calculate custom ratios. Maybe you want to create some charts that aren't available within YCharts, some bar charts, or maybe a fancy scatter plot or radar map. You could do something like that within Excel pretty easily with the data in this format. The last option here after a single company time series is to create a multi-indicator time series. So the multi-indicator time series, we're getting away from company data altogether, and this is where you can use our economic data within the data tables. So along the left, you're going to align all of the different economic indicators that you want to look at, and along the right will be the historical time periods for that data. Common use cases for the multi-indicator time series tab would be a trend analysis. So if you want to look at a couple of indicators, see how they've been trending, see peaks and troughs in the economy over time based on those specific indicators. You can also do a correlation analysis using this tool pretty easily. So pull in a couple of indicators that you have a hunch might be correlated, or maybe there's an indicator they've been hearing a lot about in the news lately, and you want to see how correlated this indicator has been with the market on recent or longer history. Or you can just use this as a snapshot of what's going on in the economy based on some indicators you like to look at, and the most recent numbers as well as the prior numbers leading up to the most recent numbers. So the functionality here, first you have to add your indicators, so you can do this one at a time here in the search bar. If I type in unemployment here, I can add the US unemployment rate. Now, one thing to keep in mind is YCharts does have about 400,000 different economic indicators, so the search bar works pretty well if you know what you're looking for. If you are looking for some ideas as to what to add to your multi-indicator time series, the economic data tab up here is a good place to start as well. But I've added my US unemployment rate, and I'm also going to add some S&P 500 data. So now I've got the daily close value for the S&P 500 here, as well as my US unemployment rate. Once again, I need to change my data options here to align my frequencies. I know the US unemployment rate is published monthly, so I'm going to choose a monthly frequency. And once again, I'm going to edit my aggregation method. So I'm looking at the average S&P level over each month compared to the US unemployment rate. So now that I have this data aligned nicely in a table, I can export it to Excel. I can open up this file, and now I can easily run a correlation analysis here to see how correlated the S&P 500 level is with the employment rate of the United States. To do so, I could just click into a cell here, use the Excel formula to run a correlation, and choose my data. And now, based on the results of that correlation analysis, I can see that there's a pretty strong negative correlation value, negative 0.88, saying that if the S&P 500, or rather if the unemployment rate gets higher, the S&P 500 might get lower, and vice versa. Now, if you wanted to use the multi-indicator time series tab here as a way to get a snapshot of the economy, a pretty good way to do that might be to use the indicators that you've saved in a watch list here in YCharts. So I can open up a watch list here. Got one called the Economy Overview. And now I can quickly come to this tab anytime, open up my Economy Overview. I can choose my data options frequency here. It looks like right now this is set at monthly. Maybe I want to make this weekly just so I can see, each week what's been updated. At the end of the month we've got some more frequent updates and get a snapshot of what's going on with the indicators that I care most about. All right, so that wraps up my overview of YCharts data tables. I certainly appreciate everybody taking the time to tune in here. And if you do have any questions, please feel free to ask those or send those over to support@ycharts.com. I look forward to helping you out with any questions in the data tables, or if you don't have access to the data tables and you'd like to know how to get access, please let us know that as well. Thanks again, and have a great day.